favorite childhood book when you were growing up? Like the book that you would ask your mom to read before you go to bed over and over so you wouldn't have to go to sleep. You know, that one that you knew word by word. Did you have a favorite book? For me, that favorite book was the classic by P.D. Eastman, Go Dog Go. Anybody remember that book? Raise your hand if you remember that book. I love that book. I don't know why, but there's an interesting recurring page throughout this short story about Go Dog Go, where these two dogs come up to each other, and this very flamboyantly dressed female dog says to this other one, "Do you like my hat?" And the other one looks at her and says, "No, I do not like your hat." And they go, "Goodbye, goodbye," and they take off. And I think the lesson that we learn from this, that we start teaching our 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds, that in the American culture, it is okay to judge people based on what they look like and what they wear. It's an important principle in culture, is to be judgmental of people and what they look like. And so I want to talk about that a little bit this morning and use it from what is my favorite book of the New Testament. I don't know if you've got a favorite book of the Bible. I think you ought to have one. There's 66 books in the Bible, and you can have one that's kind of your favorite, and I've got one. I actually have two. In the Old Testament, it's the book of Nehemiah, and the primary reason I like that book is because it's short. It's just got a few chapters, but it's got great leadership lessons for leading people, leading God's people in the church, but leadership lessons in general. And then my favorite book of the New Testament is the book of James. And it's written by Jesus' younger brother, James. And one reason I like it is because it's short. It's 5 chapters. It's like 2 pages in your Bible, and I kind of like that. Just gets right to the point about how we ought to live our Christian life, how we ought to live like Jesus. And so I want to look at the book of James today and a principle, a really important lesson about what it looks like when you get Christianity right, when you live your religion well. That's what I want to talk about. And James gets right to the point when he speaks in his book. It's kind of a knock you on the head kind of thing, that just pout right in the face, kind of kick you in the seat of the pants on this is the way you ought to live your life. And I kind of like that. That's kind of my style. And I like how one of my favorite authors, John Ortberg, wrote about it in this quote. He said, "People would often rather debate doctrine or beliefs or tradition or interpretation than actually do what Jesus said. It's not rocket science. Just go do it. Practice loving a difficult person, or try forgiving someone. Give away some money. Tell someone thank you. Encourage a friend. Bless an enemy. Say I'm sorry. Worship God. You already know more than you need to know." And that's just like what the book of James looks like. And if you know one of the verses, one of the most familiar verses in the book of James is the last verse in James chapter 1. I happen to be fortunate enough to grow up in a family that went to church Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, vacation Bible school in the summer. And if you ever had memory verses, this might have been one of the ones that you memorized as a memory verse is James chapter 1, verse 27. And James writes it this way. He said, "Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless looks like this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world." That's the kind of religion that God thinks is faultless when you get it right. And that's a great verse. But I want to look at the next verse, the next passage in James chapter 2. But interestingly, I think most of us, when we read the book of James, we think that the end of James 1 finishes one thought, and then James begins a new thought for James chapter 2. It's natural that we would think that. But if you understand the way the Bible was written 2,000 years ago, is there were no chapters and verses written in these letters, that when the guys wrote it, they were writing it by hand, and the chapter and verse designations for the scriptures were not added for another 1,200 years. It's when the Bible writers were writing the Bibles by hand and copying them in advance of a printing press or a copier, they wanted to make sure they got it right, and so they put the chapter and verse designations in there so they could make sure they didn't miss anything. But when James was writing this originally, I believe that James chapter 2 was just a continuation of this thought of what pure and faultless religion looks like. What religion looks like that God accepts when you get it right, when a church gets it right, or when you get it right living out your faith. And so let's take a look at what he says, that kind of example, another example of what pure and faultless religion looks like. James chapter 2. James records, "Brothers and sisters, believers in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ must not show favoritism. Suppose a man comes into your meeting wearing a gold ring and fine clothes, and a poor man in filthy old clothes also comes in. If you show special attention to the man wearing fine clothes and say, look, sit right here in the front row, here's a good seat for you, but you say to the poor man, you go stand way back in the back, or even on the floor. Have you not discriminated among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? Then he continues in verse 8, if you really keep the royal law found in Scripture, love your neighbor as yourself, you're doing right. But if you show favoritism like this, you sin and you're convicted by the law as lawbreakers. For whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumbles at just one point, like this, showing favoritism, you're guilty of breaking all of it. Speak and act as those who are going to be judged by the law that gives freedom. Then he finishes with this last phrase, because judgment without mercy will be shown to anyone who has not been merciful. Mercy triumphs over judgment. So you get the picture? Now, to be honest, this scene may not make a whole lot of sense to us in modern American church, because sitting on the front row obviously is not a big deal, right? There is no one on the front row. There was no one waiting for the doors to be open this morning at 8 o'clock, 8:30, rushing in to get the front row like it's a Taylor Swift concert. So the whole idea of sitting in the front row may not make a whole lot of sense, but we still have to admit that we're naturally prone to this favoritism thing, this judging people, judging a book by its cover. I found a little clip online from the cable show on Discovery Channel called Brain Games. It kind of describes how we're naturally prone to show favoritism towards people by the way they look. Let's watch that.
Imagine you're walking through the park one afternoon when you see someone fall down. Would you lend a hand? We've enlisted the help of an actress and set up a hidden camera experiment to see what strangers will do in this exact scenario. How do you think people will react once our actress hits the pavement?
I think she may have hurt herself.
That didn't take long. Within seconds, a crowd quickly gathers around, ready and willing to help. We run the experiment over and over. And every time, people responded to help her up in less than 10 seconds.
You okay? I'm okay.
It seems people will lend a helping hand to someone lying on the ground. It makes you feel good about humanity, right? But is there anything we can do to make passersby turn a blind eye to the same person? What happens when we change nothing but the way our actress looks? Would you help someone up who looks so down and out? How will people react now? How long will it take for someone to help? "30 seconds have gone by, and no one has come close to helping. They just keep walking. More than a minute has passed, and no one has helped. She's been on the ground for 15 minutes. Before you judge any of these people too harshly, ask yourself, what would you do in this situation? It seems people's brains are having a hard time seeing this woman in need. It's as if she were invisible, even to this couple sitting just 10 feet away. Why did so many people stop to help this woman, but not this one? Why does our actress's appearance make such a huge difference?
Empathy is an important motivational state for determining whether or not you will help someone in need. But what triggers our sense of empathy for others? Psychologists have long noted that we automatically categorize other people as members of our in-group or out-group.
So psychologists have figured out this is kind of what we do, isn't it? Is that we judge a book by its cover, that we take a look at someone and we show favoritism by the way that they look. And it may not look exactly the same, but we are all prone to this in one way or another, aren't we? Aren't we? I mean, it's part of the human condition. And there's this great account in the Old Testament that illustrates this in a very beautiful way. It's the account from 1 Samuel chapter 16 when Israel is choosing its second king. Saul was the first king of Israel, and he had been disqualified from leadership. And so God's primary spokesman, Samuel, his prophet, was assigned to go down to this little town called Bethlehem and choose the second king of Israel. And he was going to choose the second king from one of the sons of this very prominent citizen named Jesse. And Jesse had 8 sons. Can you imagine the grocery bill these days if you had 8 sons? I can't. I've got 1 son, and that's enough. And he's eating us out of house and home. And so he's got 8 sons. And so there is a big ceremony downtown Bethlehem, and all the inhabitants come, all the residents come. And Jesse comes in from the ranch with 7 of his 8 boys. The youngest one stays home to take care of the animals. And 7 of the boys come in, and they have, with great pomp and circumstance, Samuel says, we're going to coronate your next king. And so very naturally, in this patriarchal society, everybody would assume that Jesse's oldest son, Eli, would be the one chosen to be the next king of Israel. And so Jesse kind of pushes his son up there on stage, and Samuel takes a look at him and says, nope, not him. And everybody's kind of a little surprised and amazed. And so Jesse kind of awkwardly pushes his second son up on stage. Maybe it's him, and not him either. And they go through all 7 sons, hoping that one of them would be the one that would be coronated as the next leader of God's people. And finally, Samuel says to Jesse, is that all you got? And Jesse has to say, no, there's one left back at the house tending the sheep. All right, so he's watching the animals back home. And Samuel says to Jesse, we're not going to sit down until he arrives. And so basically he says to him, go get him, I'll wait. And so they send off back to the ranch, and eventually this little kid shows up, scruffy little kid named David. And Bible scholars agree that he's probably a preteen, 10, 12 years old. And so they push him up on stage, and Samuel says, he's the one. And everybody's amazed. They couldn't figure out why in the world would we choose the youngest, the littlest, the shepherd, to be the leader of God's people. And what they didn't understand was a very important principle that Samuel understood. And verse 7 in this account tells us this very godly principle. The Bible records, the Lord doesn't look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. And that very important principle teaches us 2 simple things, one that we like and one that we don't like. The thing that we don't like is the fact that people naturally look at the outward appearance. It's what we do, isn't it? It's not right, but it's what we do. But thankfully, God doesn't look at the outward appearance. God doesn't look at us that way. God sees people from the inside out. That's the way God sees you and me and everyone that you look at. He sees people from the inside out. The people saw a shepherd boy, but God saw a king. Which would you have seen? I think I'd have seen a shepherd boy, but God saw a king. And so if we're honest, we understand that this problem that James is addressing in this 2,000-year-old scenario is still relevant to us today. And so we have to ask, what are we going to do about it? If our lives are being steadily transformed into the image of Jesus, how do we fix this problem that is something so naturally ingrained in the heart of every human being alive on earth? Well, I wish that I had a brilliant, theologically impressive answer to share with you today, but I don't. Actually, following the example of James, I do have a very simple kind of knock you on the side of the head or kick you in the seat of the pants kind of solution. Our younger daughter, Vika, when she went to graduate school, majored in counseling to get her counseling degree. And I was fascinated to have conversations with her during her education period about all the methods and tools that she was learning to counsel people and help them to make a change in their attitude or their behaviors. And so she had a whole toolbox full of different things, different ways that she could help people. And I think I would make a terrible counselor because I think I'd likely only want to use one method for just about everybody. It's the same method that one of my favorite comedians, Bob Newhart, used in this classic old grainy sketch on his show years ago. Here it is.
Tell me about the problem that you wish to address.
Oh, okay. Well, I have this fear of being buried alive in a box. I start thinking about being buried alive, and I begin to panic.
Has anyone ever tried to bury you alive in a box?
No, but truly thinking about it does make my life horrible. I mean, I can't go through tunnels or be in an elevator or in a house, anything boxy.
So what you're saying is you're claustrophobic.
Yes, that's it.
All right. Well, let's go, Catherine. I'm going to say two words to you right now. I want you to listen to them very, very carefully. Then I want you to take them out of the office with you and incorporate them into your life.
Shall I write them down?
Well, if it makes you comfortable, it's just two words. We find most people can remember them.
Okay.
You ready?
Yes.
Okay. Here they are.
Stop it!
I'm sorry?
Stop it!
Stop it?
Yes, S-T-O-P, new word, I-T.
I think that's the kind of counselor I'd be. Who's with me? Anybody else out there? And that's why I love the book of James, because he just gets right to the point. He doesn't mince any words. It's so straightforward and easy to understand. And I read this text over and over again this week, trying to come up with some profound theological insight to bring to you this morning about how we can stop showing favoritism to people like the Bible here in James is trying to get us to do. And I think that James, the brother of Jesus, would simply say to all of us, stop it. Just stop it. If you struggle showing favoritism to people who look more lovable or more valuable than others, stop it. Did you notice that the two words that James actually did use in the very opening verse of this passage here? He said, brothers and sisters, believers in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ must not show favoritism. Basically, James is telling us to just stop it, right? Don't show favoritism. And so what does this look like for us today, 2,000 years later? If you're tempted to show favoritism to someone who grew up their whole lives in church versus someone who didn't, stop it. If you're tempted to show favoritism to someone who's been at this church for a long time versus someone who's kind of new around here, stop it, right? If you're tempted to show favoritism to someone whose skin tone is more similar to yours than someone whose skin tone is different than yours, then stop it. If you're tempted to show favoritism to someone who aligns themselves with your particular political party versus someone who aligns themselves with a different political party, stop it, right? If you're tempted to show favoritism to someone who wears a white collar to work versus someone who wears a blue collar to work, stop it. If you're tempted to show favoritism to someone who speaks English fluently because it's your primary language versus someone whose English is a little broken because it's their second or third language, stop it. If you're tempted to show favoritism to someone who went to college versus someone who didn't, stop it. If you're tempted to show favoritism to someone who roots for the local Washington football team versus someone who rooted for the Dallas Cowboys, that is just okay. All right? Maybe it's the car that they drive, or how their kids act, or the purse that they carry, or the neighborhood they live in, or the square footage in their house. If you're tempted to show favoritism towards someone based on their outward appearance, stop it. Why? Well, number one, because it's sin. We got to stop doing that because it's sin. Favoritism is sin. James said in verse 9 there in our passage, if you show favoritism, you sin. That's pretty simple, isn't it? That's like Christianity for dummies. Even I can understand that. So stop it. S-T-O-P, new word, I-T, stop it. We also need to quit doing it because it's just not like Jesus. And if anybody ever in the history of humankind knew what Jesus valued and acted like, it would be his little brother, James, right? And it's why James wrote this little book for us in the first place, to teach us how to live and act like his big brother, Jesus. And James would say that showing favoritism and judgment like this is not like his big brother, and it's not the church that Jesus died for. Because for Jesus, your self-worth was never based on your net worth, right? Your self-worth is never based on your net worth. And that's what I love about this church. this church and all the other churches that you're helping us to start every year, you get this. I believe what James is trying to teach us is this. At this church, it's okay to not be okay, right? Whether you're in the front row or the back row, it's okay. Whether you're loaded with cash or you're living paycheck to paycheck, it's okay. Whether you've been a believer for a long time or you're still checking out this whole Jesus thing, it's okay. But you also need to understand that at this church, it is not okay to be okay with not being okay. You know what I mean? It is not okay to be okay with not being okay, because at this church, they want you to heal and grow and mature and become more like Jesus every single day. And you know, at many churches, it's really okay if you're okay. You know what I mean? At a lot of churches, it's really only okay if you're okay. And I used to pastor at one of those churches, a great church. Before we moved to Virginia 27 years ago, I pastored a church in the suburbs of Detroit, Michigan. And it was a great, growing family church, a lot like this one. But it really was okay only if you were okay. And before we moved to plant this church, I knew that we were going to be planting a new church in Virginia Beach that were specifically targeting people who might have given up on the church, but they haven't yet given up on God. And so I wanted to interact and be around as many people during my time there in Michigan to kind of understand their thoughts about faith and church and spirituality, people in that category. But the problem was in our church, there weren't a whole lot of those kind of people. So I had to find other people in my life that had kind of given up on church, but they still might be interested in God. And so one of those people was this gal named Melissa who cut my hair in the salon in the mall. And we became friends because I was there every month. And now Melissa, self-admittedly, had lived a rough life. And she looked the part. And she knew that I was a pastor, and so it took her several months to warm up to me, but eventually we had some very fascinating conversations that she opened up to me about her thoughts about spiritual things and about God. And eventually, I'm kind of embarrassed to say that I invited her to come to church. I'm not embarrassed to say that, but what I'm embarrassed to say is I was kind of relieved when she said, you know what, coming to church on Sunday morning is going to be kind of hard because I'm out with my friends late most Saturday nights. And I was almost relieved when she said that because I'm not sure if she would fit in at our church. Well, fast forward a few months, on a Sunday evening church service, this was back in the day when we still had Sunday evening church for the people that were really spiritual. And so there were 12 of us at church that Sunday, and it was a summer Sunday, and I was standing back at the back of the auditorium, back by the soundboard, and we were, and a few minutes into the church service, my friend Melissa came in and sat in the back row, and I was really surprised that she was there. And midway through the service, one of the elders came up to give the communion meditation before we would take communion together. And to this day, more than 30 years later, I can still remember the gist of his communion meditation. And it's not because he talked about Jesus' death on the cross and what that accomplished for us, or what the elements meant, the blood, the juice representing the blood of Jesus, and the bread representing the body of Jesus. It wasn't any of that. What I remember 30 years later is that he walked up on stage, and for what felt like 10 minutes, went on and on and on about this was not his Sunday to give the communion meditation on Sunday night church, but the elder who was supposed to give the communion meditation was on vacation and forgot to get a substitute for who was supposed to give the meditation, and he was so embarrassed to be on stage without a coat and a tie. And when he said that, standing back in the back of the auditorium, I remember my friend Melissa literally looking down at her clothes, cut off t-shirt, flip-flops, as if to say to herself, I don't belong here. I'm not welcome here. And she never came back. And maybe you felt like that before. You need to know that you're at a church where it's okay to not be okay. You know, Jesus spent the majority of his time hanging out with people who might not feel all that welcome at church either. And so we need to stop showing favoritism to people who look more worthy or more valuable than others. One, because it's sin. Two, because it's not like Jesus. And number three, because mercy is better than judgment. James concludes this passage in Scripture with this simple, yet I think kind of odd sentence: mercy triumphs over judgment. Mercy is better than judgment. Mercy is greater than judgment. I actually like one way that one translator wrote this passage. He says, mercy liberates us from judgment. That's interesting, isn't it? Mercy liberates us from judgment. What's he mean? It means when you fall trap to the temptation to judge people based on how worthy they look or how important they look, you unwittingly become enslaved to this never-ending game of trying to figure out where you fit in on the worth scale. Does that make any sense? When you fall trapped to this natural temptation of judging people by where they fit on the worth scale, that there's people way over here that seem to be really worthy of our attention and esteem, and there's people way down here that don't seem to be worthy of our attention and esteem, then we've got to figure out every single time where we fit in the middle. And it's slavery. It's never ending. And so James finishes this passage by saying, mercy is better than judgment. Because let's face it, there will always be somebody with more money than you have and somebody with less money than you have. There will always be someone with a much nicer car than you have, and your car might be held together with duct tape. There will always be someone with a newer house or a bigger house or someone who's got a house that's practically falling apart. There will always be someone with better education than you and someone with worser education than you, right? There will always be someone with more physical ability or more physical attractiveness than you and people with less, right? And so just stop it. Just stop, because mercy triumphs over judgment. Mercy liberates us from judgment. My wife and I just very recently celebrated our 37th wedding anniversary, and as one of the exercises that we do on our anniversary date every time is we try and remember all the places that we've been for all of our anniversary dates. And the older we get, it's getting harder to remember because the list is longer and our memory is going. And we actually have a little note that we pull up eventually, but without the note, we still try to remember all the ones. And one of the early dates that we went on, I don't remember if it was our third or fourth anniversary, but we were given tickets to go see a musical by my mom in downtown Cincinnati, where we lived at the time. And she gave us these tickets, and we were going to go to downtown Cincinnati to the historic Taft Theater in downtown Cincinnati, which is named after Cincinnati's second most famous politician, William Howard Taft, the 27th President of the United States. Our most famous politician was our former mayor, Jerry Springer, but we don't talk about him. All right, and I have to admit, I was not excited about going to see a musical for my anniversary date. Now, I had never been to a musical before, but just the idea of going and listening to a bunch of actors sing the lyrics to a script for 2 hours did not sound like my idea of a good time. And so I was not all that excited. And how good, after all, could this musical be? It was kind of a new musical, and it had this weird name called Les Mis, and who knew if it was going to be any good or not, right? And so we get all spiffied up, and we drive downtown to downtown Cincinnati, and we go into the theater, and to our surprise, we are seated not in the first balcony, but in the second balcony. And not just in the second balcony, we are in the back row of the second balcony. There's a reason they call this the nosebleed seats, right? And the actors down on the stage look like little singing ants down there on the stage. And I remember finally sitting in my seat and crossing my arms and saying to myself, this is going to be a long night. But then something happened. I was blown away. We were amazed at what happened. And Lisa and I practically floated out of the theater at the end as we talked about all that we had experienced and saw at this musical. It was amazing. And looking back on that time, I'm not jealous of the people that got to sit on the front row, the probably really important people on the front row, or the slightly less important people in the first balcony, but just all of us lower level people way up in the second balcony, back row. I'm not jealous of any of them. You know why? Because someone paid our way and we got to go, right? We're just happy to be in the room. Well, if you fast forward about 5 years later, I'm pastoring this church in Detroit, Michigan, and late one afternoon, one of my friends calls me on the phone. I'm still in the office, and he says, "Hey, I've got tickets, 4 tickets to go see the Detroit Red Wings tonight. You want to go with us?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I want to go with you." And to me, this sounds like a perfect scenario for a date night, to me, right? Much better than a musical. And so I call my wife, Lisa, on the phone and say, "Lisa, you got to get a babysitter for the girls because we are going to go down to see the Red Wings in downtown Detroit." And believe it or not, Lisa was not nearly as excited about going to the Red Wings as I was, not even close. And so we meet up with our friends and we go downtown, and we are meeting at the historic Joe Louis Arena in downtown Detroit, Michigan. Do we have any hockey fans here? We're at Game 7 of the Stanley Cup is coming here this weekend. And Joe Louis Arena is like the epicenter of hockey in America. It's called Hockey Town, USA. And this happened to be the year, one of the years, that the Red Wings won the Stanley Cup. And so the entire stadium was sold out for the whole season. Tickets were nearly impossible to get. And so we go downtown, we get in, and I would have been happy to be in the upper deck, even in the back row, just to be able to get in to see the Red Wings when you couldn't get in. But what I didn't know is that my friend's wife was a vice president of this little company called Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan. And we had their executive seats. We were on the front row. And not just the front row, we were on the front row right next to where the Red Wings sat, where the little door goes open, they go sit down, and my wife is seated right next to the Red Wings. And she didn't want to be there, but it only took her a few minutes before she's right there with us, banging on the glass, when guy's face gets smashed against the boards. And it was epic. It was really awesome. And looking back on that, I can think about all those people that were in the arena that night and saw us seated in seats 1, 2, 3, and 4 on the front row, and they must have thought we were really important people. We must be really special people to be able to get those seats. And if they'd asked, "What makes you so special to be in those seats?" I just would have pointed to my friends and said, "Hey, they paid our way. We're just happy to be in the room. They bought our tickets." And I think that's the point that James is trying to teach us here in this lesson here in James chapter 2, is that it doesn't matter whether you're in the front row or the back row or anywhere in between. It doesn't matter if you're okay or not okay. Someone else paid our way, and we're just happy to be in the room. And if people ask you, "Why do you go to this church and sit here near the front row or in the back row?" And if your life looks like it's all put together or you're just hanging on by a thread, you're welcome here. It's okay to not be okay. Someone else paid our way, and we're just happy to be in the room. And when we get to heaven and we look at the whole arena of people that are there, there's going to be people there that look way better than us and people there that surprisingly look way worse than us. And they're all going to be there, not because of what they look like, but because someone else paid their way, bought their tickets, and we're all going to be happy to be in the room. Because it's what Jesus did.